The words we use to talk about history matter. In this series so far, we've discussed how indigenous communities like the Hohokam and Chaco name themselves, even if we don't exactly know what those names were. We've used words like enslaved people instead of slaves because it helps us remember that slavery isn't who someone is, but rather something that's being done to another human being. In this episode, we're going to tackle another loaded phrase: westward expansion. Expansion sounds like a balloon filling with air, just growing, growing, growing. It also sounds fairly easy, gentle, or even noble, like expanding westward could be fate or destiny. But westward expansion is a phrase that hides the assumptions made explicit in a different phrase that some 19th century Americans used: manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that the US is destined by God to expand across and control the entire North American continent. There was nothing easy about going west if you were a settler. Nothing gentle about having settlers occupy your land if you were indigenous, Mexican, or Californio. And like we've said all along, none of history is guaranteed. Westward expansion wasn't destined to happen. It was the product of many individual choices that can't be fully captured in any one phrase. That's why we're taking a whole episode to talk about it. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall U.S. History to 1865. Much like everything else in American history, the story of westward expansion is wrapped up in the issue of slavery. In the 1830s, Georgia's westward border with states like Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama was considered to be a frontier. The white American settlers, in favor of expanding slavery, wanted new land to grow their crops. And what better place than thousands of acres in the West? But as we know, those thousands of acres weren't empty. There were communities of people who had been living in those regions for centuries and had well established systems, like the Muskogee and Cherokee tribes. For instance, both the Muskogee and Cherokee had some form of democratic or republican government. The Muskogees elected a body of leaders that advised their chief, while the Cherokee Nation was established as a democratic government led by a chief, vice chief, and 32 council members. Both nations used their well organized populations to resist American intrusion on their land, which took many forms, including legal challenges throughout the 1830s. Specifically, the Cherokee Nation sought an injunction by the Supreme Court to stop Georgia from carrying out laws the state had passed that stripped local indigenous tribes of their rights. And in 1832, the Supreme Court heard a case to determine whether the Cherokees had sovereignty on their land in Georgia. In Worcester versus Georgia, the court held that the Cherokees did have sovereignty. So, according to them, Georgia had no right to expand westward and enforce its laws on the indigenous folks that already lived there. But there was one not so slight problem. The Supreme Court in the United States has no enforcement power. And the person that did have enforcement power in 1832, President Andrew Jackson, was not interested in upholding the court's decision. Jackson had a track record of insisting that indigenous Americans have no place in the modern United States. In 1830, he asked Congress, what good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms? Jackson's voter base consisted largely of non-elite white people who saw westward expansion as an opportunity to grow, like those Georgia frontier settlers who wanted more room for their crops. But there were lots of motivations pointing towards the same goal. Some wealthy white Americans wanted to become even wealthier by accumulating more agricultural land. Other people believed that white settlers had a right to the land because, well, they were white. This list could go on and on. So in Washington, D.C., there was tremendous pressure for Indigenous American removal. Removal was the forced migration of indigenous tribes from one place, usually their homeland, to another place not of their choosing. Now, the word removal makes this process sound clinical and painless, like how you might remove a poster from your bedroom wall when it's not your vibe anymore. But it's another one of those loaded words. Removal was actually a deadly, horrifying process. It's important to recognize that between 1830 and 1850, about 100,000 indigenous Americans living between Michigan, Louisiana, and Florida moved west based on treaties coerced by the US government or forcibly and brutally by the US Army if they resisted, sometimes in chains. For instance, it's estimated that 3,500 Muskogee died on their westward journey. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the US government to exchange indigenous land in the Southeast for land across the Mississippi River in Oklahoma. Technically, this law required the US government to negotiate fairly with Indigenous Americans. But in practice, we ended up with situations like Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. The negotiation happened, and then Jackson ignored it. Jackson's determination to open more land for white settlers continued the ongoing displacement of indigenous peoples that we've seen throughout the history of the colonies and nation. From 1830 to about 1850, southeastern tribes like the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole were forced westward. Jackson's refusal to accept the Supreme Court decision defending Cherokee sovereignty led to what is known as the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Now, when we read about the Trail of Tears, different sources might use this term to refer to different parts of what was happening at the time. The Cherokee Trail of Tears refers to the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation from Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama, and their sometimes over 5,000-mile journey across what's now 9 different states. Along the way, thousands died by bayoneting, disease, starvation, and exposure to weather. Let's also be clear about another point. There were still indigenous communities east of the Mississippi after 1840. Roughly 1,000 Cherokees remained in western Tennessee and North Carolina after the Trail of Tears and formed a new tribal government in the 1860s. The descendants of those initial 1,000 still exist today as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. As a result of the Trail of Tears, white settlers began flocking to the now unoccupied land around the Mississippi River. And because westward expansion was like an ever-inflating balloon, the Democratic Party went all in on Manifest Destiny and started to advocate that the United States acquire even more land. They set their sights further west, to territories like California, Texas, and Oregon. This hunger for land basically expected indigenous people to constantly uproot and relocate thanks to broad Indian removal policy. For example, starting in 1840, the Ho-Chunk were removed from Wisconsin to northeastern Iowa, from Iowa to Minnesota, from Minnesota to South Dakota, and finally to Nebraska in 1865. Even before white American settlers got involved, the indigenous communities that lived in the West were trying to protect their homes from settlers. Specifically, in the 1820s, Mexico was trying to strengthen its control over its northern territories after gaining independence from Spanish colonial rule. Now, what was called California was a lot bigger then than it is now. A bit that looks a lot more like what we think of now as California, called Alta California at the time, was owned by Spanish missions. These missions began as an attempt to convert displaced indigenous Californian tribes, like the Chumash and the Cahuilla nations, and there was a long history of dispossessed indigenous tribes living and working on territory controlled by church, state, or a combination of the two. But when Mexico confiscated the missions in a series of laws passed in 1834, the Mexican government granted the new land to Californios, people who were born in California from Spanish and Mexican settlers. And the Indigenous Americans who were living and working at the missions at this time lost their homes and jobs. Some had the skills necessary to stay and work as farmhands or vaqueros, which are cowboys on ranchos or farms. Others left and did their best to return to their tribal nations. Meanwhile, Texas was sparsely populated during the early 1830s, only having some 20,000 settlers in the entire region. This made the area particularly vulnerable to attacks by the stronger and better organized indigenous communities, like the Comanche. To attract more settlers, Texas tried to be a welcoming neighbor by inviting white American settlers to populate the region alongside Mexican settlers and work collectively as Mexican citizens. But many of the white American settlers just heard more land and wanted to do their own thing, including ignoring the prohibitions on slavery Mexico passed in the 1820s. Many of these American settlers were also Protestants, even though Mexican law required settlers to be Catholics, causing a lot of tension. As a result of the American settlers', rudeness and rampant refusal to assimilate, Mexico reversed its welcoming policy in 1830. Then, in 1835, the general and president of Mexico, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, began targeting rebellious Texan residents. Soon, the Texas Revolution was underway, where American and Mexican settlers worked together to rebel against the Mexican government. In 1836, Texas won independence from Mexico after the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto. And even though America had its eyes set on adding Texas to its rapidly growing list of states, Texas didn't immediately join. Oh no. For 9 years, Texas was technically its own country. And that's for many of the same arguments that happened every time territory was added to the US and people fought over the consequences for slavery. In Oregon, after Lewis and Clark's expedition from 1804 to 1806, there were both American and British settlers who displaced indigenous tribes like the Nez Perce or the Chinook. Then, starting in the 1840s, hundreds of thousands of Americans took the Oregon Trail from Independence, Missouri, and settled in Utah, Oregon, and California. All of this takes us to the United States presidential election of 1844. The Democrat James K. Polk ran against Henry Clay, the Whig nominee. Polk ran on one major policy: manifest destiny. He argued that Oregon should be reoccupied by Americans, as if white American settlers were there the whole time. He argued that Texas should be re-annexed, and he promised to negotiate a deal to add California as a new territory. In a shock upset, Polk defeated Clay and took office, making him the first dark horse president to come out of nowhere and win. And during his term, he followed through on his promises to expand the US. In 1846, he worked out a treaty with Britain over the Oregon Territory, setting the upper limit of Oregon at the 49th parallel rather than the 54th. This gave the United States the present-day states of Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, as well as control of the Columbia River. Mexico refused to negotiate over California. So, in April 1846, Polk sent American soldiers to disputed land near the Rio Grande between Mexico and Texas as a threat. And when fighting broke out in May, Polk and Congress swiftly declared war, claiming it was in response to the fact that Mexico shed blood upon American soil. The Mexican-American War played out in three basic parts. First up, New Mexico. The Apache, Comanche, and Ute people, who were native to the area, had developed powerful societies, and the Mexican settlers who moved in, called Hispanos, had plenty of conflict with those indigenous communities and not a lot of help from the Mexican government. So, when American soldiers headed to New Mexico in 1846, the Hispanos were pretty ambivalent about defending Mexico, and America took power fairly easily. Second up, California. The California campaign ended fairly quickly when future presidential candidate John C. Fremont defeated Mexico by 1847. Third and last up, Central Mexico, where the fighting was heaviest. In August 1846, Mexican leader Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna promised to negotiate an end to the war if he was allowed out of exile in Cuba. Polk agreed. But after returning from exile, Santa Anna broke his promise and refused to surrender, sticking with his Mexican allegiance. The fighting escalated, but American soldiers took control of successive cities in Mexico, beginning with Veracruz and heading towards Mexico City. Interestingly, they mostly used the same trek that Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés took against the Aztecs hundreds of years earlier. In 1848, Mexico and the United States agreed to peace with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty required Mexico to cede 55% of its territory, giving the United States the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming, and of course, Texas. In 1854, the Gadsden Purchase was finalized and would officially complete the U.S. takeover of the present-day American Southwest. Though, of course, any Native American communities who lived there weren't consulted at all or were forcibly moved by the white settlers who were moving in. For many Democrats, this expansion was a dream come true. But not everyone was on board with Westward Expansion or the Mexican-American War. For example, future President Abraham Lincoln, still just a freshman congressperson, called out the conflict with Mexico and rejected Polk's claim it was a defensive war. That dissent between Americans wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Because with more land comes more debates over what to do with that land. Would slavery be allowed in all of the territories? None of them, some of them. In fact, the tensions would just keep rising as we move into the final few decades before the American Civil War. But that's a story for another episode. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is a part of the Study Hall project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time.